I hate to admit this, but chainsaws are not my favorite things to work on. I don't mind a challenge, but I also don't want to waste my precious time on something that I know would benefit by getting new parts. However, I'm also a huge cheapskate, so when I can, I will try and save a buck or two. But this time, things don't go the way that I want them to, and I end up learning a very important lesson. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at this very dirty orange chainsaw, and the problem is that it's really tough to start. However, most times it's impossible to even get it to start, and you end up tired and very disappointed. Now, I am going to try and repair this chainsaw, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in this video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now the funny part about this chainsaw was that when I first got it from my friend, I tried to start it and it fired right up and ran right in front of him. However, after that first time, I haven't been able to get it to start and run that way again. Now this does tell me that this chainsaw is in working condition with plenty of compression from the engine and a working ignition system. That meant the fuel that was in the tank was more than likely good and that the carb must be the problem. But if your chainsaw won't start at all, then you might have to check that the fuel is fresh, that there's spark at the plug, and that the engine is not worn out. Of course, the best way to check and see if the engine is not worn out is to use a compression tester. However, you can get a pretty good idea on the compression by slowly pulling on the rope. And if the engine is fighting back quite a bit, then there's a good chance that the compression is decent. However, if there's very little resistance from the engine, then it might be worn out because of damage. Next, I want to try and start the engine and show you what it's doing, but we first need to confirm that there's plenty of oil and fuel in it first. So as you just saw, it does at least try and start, but this is how it's been acting after the first time I was able to get it to run. Now you do have to remember that every time you fail to get an engine to start and run, it does increase the chance that the engine will be flooded with extra fuel from those failed attempts. And it's best to try and start the engine without the choke after your first failed attempt to even start it. This will then give the engine a chance to use all that extra fuel instead of making a flooded engine even more flooded the next time you try and start it. Now, if you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I try and give the machines I work on a quick cleaning before I try and fix them. This will keep dirt and oil from getting into places where it shouldn't be, like inside the engine and all over my equipment that I film with. And of course, chainsaws are extremely bad at being dirty since the chain needs oil to keep them working without destroying the bar. I'm also going to take a peek behind the side cover and see just how much oil and dirt is packed underneath it. And we were not disappointed by what we find here because it's pretty gross, which means we'll need to give it a good cleaning as well. It would also be a great idea to clean around the other side of the cover as well, but luckily it's not that bad here. I'm also going to take the bar and chain off so that we can give it a quick rinse to get rid of any dirt that might get in the way of the oiling system. Now, some of you are going to say that I'm going a bit too far with the cleaning that I do, and to be honest, I'm going to have to agree with you. But I do think that the chainsaw would benefit from it, so I don't mind doing it. Of course, I wouldn't go to this extent in cleaning after each and every use, but once in a while probably wouldn't hurt. Now, once everything has been rinsed off, I do want to give the parts a couple of minutes to dry off before we start to put them together, which shouldn't take too long depending upon how warm it is during the cleaning. Now, if you don't have that much time to let the parts sit around and dry off, then use some compressed air to help get rid of that water. Now, because of my schedule, this is actually the next day, which means we can begin to put the saw back together again. Now, this would be a great time to examine the drive gear on the clutch drum for any sort of wear, but as you can see on this one, there's very little wear on it. However, if yours has deep grooves in it from the chain, I would recommend that you replace the clutch drum, because if you don't, it could cause the chain to become loose over time, which could cause it to come off the bar, which is something you don't want it to do. Also, when installing the bar and chain, I'd recommend that you lift up the bar while making your adjustments on the chain tension. Of course, that is only a recommendation, and if you have your own way of doing it, then by all means, keep doing it. Now, I'm going to leave the amount of tension on the chain up to you, but I would typically leave just a tiny bit of slack on my chain, while others may not give it any sort of slack. And after you tighten down the bar nut with a lot of care, make sure that the chain will move along the bar without getting stuck, otherwise you might have problems later on once you start cutting. Now, even though I know the engine was able to run with the fuel that was in the tank, I still think it's worth a quick look. So the fuel that came out of the tank was a little bit heavy with two-stroke oil, but it still smells like gasoline and not paint thinner, so I think it's still usable. Also, while we're here, we might as well take a better look at the fuel filter, and as you can see, it's in great shape, and the fuel line that it's connected to is also in great condition as well. Now, if the fuel filter had become disconnected from the fuel line, it could mean that the inlet screen inside the carb might be clogged with debris that the filter should have caught. Of course, we were going to take the carb off and inspect it anyway, but at least we won't have to worry about a clogged screen. While I have this chance, I'm also going to take a look at the spark plug, and what I'm looking for is any damage to it or excessive carbon buildup that could be interfering with the spark. Now, I don't really see any excess carbon on the end of the spark plug, but what I do see is that it's wet with two-stroke oil. Now, I could just use my torch to burn off the oil, but this time I'm just going to use some carb cleaner instead. I'm also going to check that the gap on the ground is where it needs to be, but come to find out, it's actually much too big. After giving it a couple of calibrated taps on the table, it's now where I want it to be. Now, since the spark plug is out of the engine, this would be a great time to install a compression tester and find out just how worn out this engine really is. We want a reading well over 100 psi, and the higher the better. So after several pulls of the rope, the reading is about 135 psi, which is pretty good. Now, it's not spectacular, but it does mean that the engine is not damaged and is fairly healthy. Now, the next part is the part you've been waiting for, which is trying to get to the carb, and this is when things turn from good to bad, but not in the way you would think. But first, let me explain what my methods are when it comes to carbs like this one. So when it comes to a diaphragm carb like this one, I will typically take them apart and then put the parts in the ultrasonic cleaner. Then once they come out after 2 or 3 cycles, I'll then check and make sure that fuel will pass through the inlet screen, replace the purge bulb if needed, and then install a new metering diaphragm. Now, the diaphragm's job is to control fuel flow through the carb, and it does this by pressing against the rocker arm attached to the needle. Now, to be able to do this, the diaphragm needs to be very pliable, emphasis on the word very. Because the diaphragm can be flexible, but if it's not flexible enough, it's going to have some problems working the needle. So here comes the most important part about this repair. You see, I only carry a couple of the most common styles of metering diaphragms. If you hadn't figured it out, this one is not going to be your typical diaphragm. So after taking off this section over the diaphragm, what we're looking at is a very uncommon style of diaphragm. It has a couple of different openings in it that help to work with this particular style of carb, which is not your everyday carb. The worst part, as you might have guessed, is that this diaphragm is not in good condition at all and will need to be replaced. And even though it does have some flex to it, it's not flexible enough to do a good job, and that's why the engine is having problems starting. So here's the big question, isn't this supposed to be a quality chainsaw when compared to a lot of the other ones you'll find at a big box store? So how could this happen to it? Now, unfortunately, a $300 chainsaw will eventually have the same problems as a cheap one. However, it might just take a little bit more time for it to happen. So here comes the main point to this entire video. As usual, I took the carb apart and put the parts into the ultrasonic cleaner. However, things didn't go according to plan. Now, if you couldn't tell, I didn't bother to include the footage of me taking the carb apart, cleaning it, and then putting it back together, and that was done on purpose. Now, the main reason why is because I decided to take the easy way out instead, and that's because of the metering diaphragm that I just put into my rejuvenation bath. So why didn't I include the process of working on the carb then? Because, well, it didn't work out, and if I showed you the failed process, I'll just be wasting your precious time. Now, I am including the footage of me putting the carb back in, even if it's not going to work, because this part is important to show. Now, I haven't told you what the easy way out was, and if you hadn't figured it out by this point, I chose to replace the carb, and the reason why you might not agree with. Remember when I said that I only carry the most common types of diaphragms, so if I have to order a different one, I'd rather just order a new carb instead, and the reason why is cost. Now, to get the rebuild kit for this carb, it was going to cost between $13 and $15 from a trusted seller in the US and not an overseas one. But the cost of an aftermarket carb with extra parts was only a couple of bucks more, and even less if I only got the carb. So let me put the pieces together and see if you can see what I'm looking at. I tried to clean the carb and rejuvenate the old diaphragm, but it still didn't work. So I opted to get a new carb instead because buying a whole new carb made it a plug-and-play repair without the risk of the old one having more issues that I haven't figured out yet. So it's up to you to decide if I took the easy way out or if I made the choice based on risk and time. Now, I'd like to think that I made the best choice, however, how I see it and the way you see it may not be the same, which is perfectly fine. Also, since I've never seen this chainsaw before, I took a look at the spark arrestor screen to make sure that it wasn't clogged with carbon. Luckily, it wasn't, so we'll just put it back in the outlet of the muffler. That way it can do its job of keeping sparks from leaving the muffler and possibly starting a grass fire. Now, if the screen was clogged, it could cause the engine to not be able to get to full speed, but if it was really bad, it could cause starting problems as well. Now, you might be asking how I knew the carb was having problems, and the answer is pretty simple. The first sign was that the purge bulb was having a problem filling with fuel, and if that happens, it means the engine is very unlikely to start. Now, it's not always a given, but when I did try and start it, it was basically still having the same problem as before. That meant I can either take the carb apart again and install a rebuild kit or just replace it. Of course, as I explained before earlier, I ended up replacing the carb, but I'm not going to show you the process again since you've already seen it. So after replacing the carb with a new one, we'll then add some bar oil to the chainsaw and then we'll try starting it. Now, I do apologize for the abrupt ending to that test start, and yes, I know that wasn't much of a branch I was cutting. However, there aren't too many down trees that I can get to, so this will have to do for right now. And besides, all I needed to do was to put some sort of a load on the engine to make sure that it wouldn't bog down when cutting. So I still ended up doing my usual cleaning, reassembly, and test start, but only to find out that we had an issue with the carb. But after installing the new aftermarket carb, it's now back to working condition and it's at least usable now, which is better than it was before. Now, I don't expect you to agree with my choice. In fact, I would hope that you would question it, but I think I made the right choice, and as you can see, I think it paid off as well. So my question is, do you think I made the right choice in replacing the carb versus rebuilding the OEM one? And if you don't agree with my choice, I'm perfectly fine with it. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.